The phone rang at 2:17 in the morning. I have always feared calls that come in the middle of the night, calls that carry news too terrible to wait until morning. I let it ring 3 times before I finally reached for the phone, my hands trembling. Mrs. Lawson? This is Baylor Plano Hospital. Your son, Andre, has just been admitted to the emergency department with a suspected ruptured cerebral aneurysm. You should come immediately. The entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. I am 65 years old. I lost my husband a decade ago. But nothing, no pain I have ever known, could have prepared me for this moment. Andre, my only son, intelligent and kind, could not be dying. It did not belong to the natural order of life. But that was only the beginning of the nightmare. Because when I arrived at the hospital, when the doctor told me that my son was gone, the way my daughter-in-law reacted to the news sent a chill straight through my spine. And what I discovered afterward, about Andre's real marriage, about the woman I thought I understood, and about what my son had quietly done to protect my grandson before it was too late, changed everything. My name is Patricia Lawson, and this is the story of how I fought to protect my grandson from his own mother. I arrived at Baylor Plano Hospital while it was still pitch dark outside. I was wearing my nightgown under my coat, my hair unbrushed, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip my purse strap just to keep my documents from falling. I handed my ID to the receptionist, my voice sounding like it didn't belong to me. A doctor with a solemn face led me into a private consultation room, and the words that followed shattered my world. A large cerebral aneurysm, no prior warning signs. We did everything we could, but he has passed. Has passed. My Andre has passed. I remember sitting down, but I don't remember who helped me. I only remember the sound that escaped my throat, a small, wounded moan like an injured animal. And I remember the hollow feeling in my chest, as if someone had carved my heart out without using a blade. Andre, the baby I held in my arms for the first time 40 years ago, in this very hospital. The child who cried all through his first night, whom I soothed with the lullaby my own mother used to sing. The boy who clung to me on his first day of school, the young man who cried on my shoulder when his father died, the adult who called me every Sunday, never missing a single week for the past 10 years. Now, he was gone. The next few hours passed like a terrible dream. Papers were brought in. One decision followed another, decisions no mother should ever have to make. I signed with numb hands, reading words I could barely comprehend, as if they belonged to someone else's life. Near midday, Nicole, Andre's wife of 10 years, finally arrived. Nicole walked into the hospital as if she were entering a business meeting. Expensive designer sunglasses covered her eyes, a perfectly tailored black suit, manicured nails tapping lightly against her phone screen. "Traffic," she said without looking at me, and I had to find someone to watch Miles. Miles. My 8-year-old grandson. I had already called Miles's school, spoken to his teacher, and arranged for him to stay with his best friend for the day. The fact that Nicole hadn't even thought of that, hadn't thought about how to manage things so her son would know what was happening to his father, was so very Nicole, reacting only after everything had already happened. I looked straight at her and said simply, "Andre is gone." Nicole's perfectly painted lips parted into a small O. Her hand flew to her throat, a gesture that might have seemed instinctive. But I had observed Nicole's calculated performances for too many years to know what was reflex and what was theater. "But he was fine yesterday," Nicole said, her voice catching. "We had dinner together, then he worked in his study. I went to bed early. I didn't even get to say goodbye." For a very brief moment, I thought I saw something real flicker across her face. Then, it disappeared. In its place was something I couldn't quite name, relief or calculation. Whatever it was quickly masked by a more appropriate expression, shock and grief. I stood there, and the mind of a woman who had spent 30 years as a psychology professor at the University of North Texas did what it had been trained to do: read people. and what I read in Nicole made my stomach tighten. This was not the face of a woman who had just lost her husband. This was the face of a woman who was assessing the situation. As the day went on, I watched Nicole make hushed phone calls, always stepping away whenever hospital staff approached to discuss funeral arrangements. When it came time to make decisions about Andre's remains, Nicole calmly pushed the responsibility onto me. "You know what he would want better than I do," she said, her eyes still glued to her phone. What he would want, not what she would want. Not what her husband would want. That phrase pierced my heart like a needle. By evening, as we waited for Andre's body to be transferred to the funeral home, Harold Bennett arrived, Andre's closest friend since law school, and also his personal attorney. Harold's grief was real. It showed in his red eyes and in the tight embrace he gave me, as if he were trying to hold on to something that could no longer be held. "I can't believe he's gone," Harold whispered. "I had lunch with him on Monday." I could only nod. The pain left me unable to speak. Harold turned to Nicole and offered his condolences. Nicole responded with a somber nod. Neat, restrained, exactly sufficient, as if she were observing proper etiquette. Then Harold said, his professional tone returning, "We'll need to meet soon. There are matters in Andre's will that require immediate attention." Nicole straightened instantly. She pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at eyes that were suspiciously dry behind her sunglasses. "Of course," she said. "Perhaps tomorrow." "I'd like to resolve everything quickly. For Miles." Hearing Miles's name snapped me back to reality. Miles, the child who had just lost his father, and his mother was already thinking about resolving things quickly. "Miles should be told in person," I said firmly. "I'll go with you to pick him up." "That won't be necessary," Nicole replied at once. "I can handle my son myself." She emphasized the word "my." I didn't miss it. This was a familiar tactic, Nicole asserting control over Miles when it served her image as a devoted mother, while delegating the actual labor of parenting to Andre, and increasingly to me. "He adores you," Nicole added, her voice artificially soft. "He's going to need his grandmother more than ever." I understood immediately. This was manipulation. Nicole was positioning herself, keeping me close to continue caring for the child, while simultaneously drawing a clear line of authority. Miles belonged to her, and she was the decision-maker. As we left the hospital, I caught a glimpse of Nicole checking her reflection in the glass doors, adjusting her hair before placing yet another call. In that unguarded moment, with no audience, there was no trace of grief or panic on her face. There was only one thing: cold calculation, like a chess player preparing her next move. I turned away, my heart breaking all over again, not only because I had lost Andre, but because I could see it clearly now. Miles was in the hands of a woman who viewed his father's death as an inconvenience, or worse, an opportunity. At the time, I had no way of knowing that Andre had foreseen this scenario, and before he died, my son had quietly put special measures in place to protect both me and Miles from the very woman he ultimately realized was a threat to us both. In the days that followed, I moved through a fog of grief as I planned my son's funeral, and it was during that time that I began to brush against another truth: Andre's foresight and the depth of Nicole's deception. But that night, when I returned to my empty house, all I could do was clutch a photograph of Andre as a child to my chest and ask myself how I could possibly be strong enough to face the days ahead. For Miles, I told myself, I have to be strong. For Miles. Something in Nicole's behavior had awakened every protective instinct in me. My grandson had lost his father. I was determined he would not lose his grandmother as well, not when I knew he would need me more than ever. A late-night phone call had shattered my world, but my daughter-in-law's reaction to my son's death, something about it was wrong. What secrets had Andre been hiding in that decaying marriage, and what had he prepared to protect us before it was too late? I had attended enough funerals in my 65 years to recognize genuine grief. It manifests differently in everyone. Some collapse, some grow angry, some become eerily calm. But however it appears, there is always an authenticity that cannot be faked. So when I sat in the front pew of Willow Bend Community Church, watching people approach Andre's casket, it felt like I was observing a masterclass in Nicole's emotional performance. Nicole wore a perfectly fitted black designer dress that flattered her figure. Softly curled hair, impeccable understated makeup. Clearly waterproof mascara because from time to time she dabbed a patterned handkerchief at her eyes, yet those eyes remained dry. She leaned lightly against me at carefully timed moments, whispering lines such as, "He would be so grateful that so many people came," and Andre always spoke so highly of everyone here. To outsiders, we looked like a united front of shared grief, a shattered widow and a devastated mother supporting one another. But only I could feel how lightly she leaned on my shoulder and how quickly she straightened whenever someone important approached. Only I noticed how her eyes constantly swept the room, measuring each person's social and financial status. Only I caught the subtle shift in her voice when she spoke to Andre's wealthy clients versus his childhood friends. But what hurt me the most was not Nicole. It was Miles. He sat beside me, his small body occasionally trembling with suppressed sobs. Unlike his mother, Miles's grief was raw and real. His face was flushed, tears streaming freely. I wrapped an arm around him, offered tissues, and whispered comfort as he stared at the casket. "Is Dad really in there, Grandma?" he asked during a pause in the service. "His body is," I answered softly. "But the special part that made him your dad, his love, his thoughts, his spirit, is still with you." Miles nodded, as if he understood that distinction better than many adults. "I still feel Dad sometimes," he said. "Like he's watching me." "I believe he is," I replied, swallowing my tears. At that moment, Nicole leaned past me, her voice sharp and cold. "Miles, sit up straight. People are watching." I felt his shoulders stiffen beneath my arm. Her concern for appearances over her son's emotions. This was exactly why Andre had been leaving Miles with me more and more over the past year. After the service, the line of mourners seemed endless. Andre was beloved by his colleagues at the Haynes and Boone law firm in Plano, by clients he had helped, by neighbors and friends. Each brought a story of my son's kindness, integrity, and quiet humor. "Your son helped me keep my house during my divorce," one woman said, gripping my hands. "He reduced his fees when he learned I was struggling, and even connected me with a financial advisor so I could get back on my feet. Andre was the only lawyer who took my discrimination case when no one else would," an older man said. "He cared about justice, not just billable hours." Their words were both comforting and agonizing. Still, I made a point to remember every story, every detail, because I knew that one day Miles would need them as a way to keep his father close. Throughout the reception, I noticed Nicole engaged in hushed, tense conversations with several people, among them a tall man dressed in very expensive clothing, whom I did not recognize. When I approached, they separated smoothly. Nicole introduced him. "This is Sean Whitaker, one of Andre's real estate investment partners." "My condolences, Mrs. Lawson," he said, shaking my hand, briefly, coldly, without warmth. Andre was a remarkable man. Something about Sean's tone felt off, and the way Nicole's hand rested lightly on his arm, too natural, too familiar, suggested an acquaintance that went beyond business. I noted the detail. The mind of a professor still categorized behavior automatically, even as my heart was breaking. By the end of the evening, exhaustion nearly overwhelmed me. Miles had fallen asleep on a sofa in a private room of the funeral home, drained by grief. I draped my jacket over him like a blanket when Harold Bennett approached, lowering his voice. "Patricia, may we speak privately for a moment?" If you've stayed with me this far, leave a comment with the word Miles so I know you're still here with me, because in the next part, Harold Bennett will say one sentence. That will make me realize Andre did not die as unexpectedly as I believed, and what my son left behind was not just a will, but a carefully prepared plan of protection. I followed Harold toward a secluded corner, far away from the mourners still lingering in the reception area of the funeral home. There were no curious stares there, no whispers, only the steady hum of the air conditioner and the suffocating scent of white flowers. Andre left very clear instructions on certain matters, Harold said, keeping his voice low. I can't go into details right now, but he required me to tell you one thing, immediately. Harold looked straight at me. His expression was so serious that I felt my heart start beating faster. Trust your instincts about Miles, he said. Does that mean anything to you? I glanced toward Miles, my grandson, asleep on the sofa, his face still dotted with the faint traces of dried tears. Then I looked over at Nicole. She was checking herself in a compact mirror, inspecting her makeup as if this were an event where image had to be maintained, all while nodding numbly at condolences. Yes, I answered slowly. I think it does. Harold nodded, as if my response confirmed something he had already known. Good. Tomorrow we'll have an official meeting about the will, he said. But Andre wants you to know that... Harold hesitated, weighing each word with careful precision. Arrangements have been made, for both of you. I hadn't even had the chance to ask, what arrangements, when Nicole walked over. A polite, ready-made smile was already set on her lips, the kind people use when they know they're being watched. Harold, I hope we can resolve everything quickly, Nicole said, her voice gentle but firm. I've been thinking about taking Miles away for a while after all of this, a healing trip. I think it would be best to handle the property matters quickly. Of course, Harold replied evenly, giving nothing away. My office, tomorrow at 2. As we prepared to leave, I bent down and lifted Miles into my arms. He didn't weigh much, but in that moment, his weight became something precious, the kind of burden a person would willingly carry for a lifetime. Nicole made no move to help. She only scrolled through her phone screen, then sighed like someone carrying the entire world. 17 calls, she said. Calls. So many arrangements to make. I looked at her composed face and realized what made me shiver. There was no sign of a woman who had just lost her husband. No swollen eyes, no slumped shoulders from exhaustion, no stunned silence after a shock, only alertness, too much of it. What arrangements? I asked, trying to keep my tone more curious than accusatory. Life goes on, Patricia, Nicole replied, her eyes never leaving the screen. Bills, accounts, notifications. Andre handled everything. Now it's all on me. Not us. Not we'll take care of Miles together. Only me. That single word said so much. When I placed Miles into my car, because Sophia had offered that I keep him overnight so she could have space to manage things, I suddenly felt a strange sense of foreboding. It mixed with something else, almost like the invisible presence of Andre standing somewhere behind my shoulder, urging me to be vigilant, to observe, to protect what he could no longer protect himself. We'll be okay, Miles, I whispered to my sleeping grandson. Somehow, we'll be okay. I had no idea how fiercely that promise would be tested. That night, in my quiet house in the colony, a compact neighborhood about a 15-minute drive from Willow Bend, I couldn't sleep. Miles slept in the guest room I always prepared for the nights he stayed over. A small bed, a few of Andre's old toys I had taken down from the attic. The books Miles loved most. I lay in my own room, but my ears kept tracking the steady rhythm of his breathing in the next room. It was the only sound keeping me from sinking completely into grief. Andre, my son, what song did I sing to you when you were born? His eye is on the sparrow. The song my mother, your grandmother, whom you never got to meet, sang to me when I was little. Now Miles lay there, fatherless, and I had to sing that song again for a third generation. Tears ran down my face, soaking into my pillow. This time they were not silent tears. They were choking sobs I had held in all day. My body shook as if it were trying to force the pain out through every pore. How could you go before me, Andre? That wasn't how this was supposed to happen. And if you're listening up to this point, pay attention to one small detail I couldn't name at the time, but later I realized it mattered more than I ever understood. Throughout the funeral, Nicole kept talking about assets, about arrangements, about resolving things quickly. But Nicole never once spoke about Andre as a human being. She never said how much he suffered before he went. She never said what our 10 years were like. She never said how Miles will miss his dad. Only plans, only tasks, only something that felt like she was preparing for a negotiation instead of mourning. And because of that, the next morning when I walked into Harold's law office, I was no longer a woman who could only cry. I walked in like a mother, ready to protect her grandson. The next morning, after I dropped Miles off at Jasper High, where his teacher had been incredibly supportive, I drove to Harold's law office in downtown Plano. Nicole arrived before I did. She was sitting in the conference room with a man in a suit, not Harold. When I stepped inside, Nicole introduced him as her personal attorney, Gerald Winters from Mitchell and Blackwell. Harold looked at me. There was something in his eyes I couldn't quite decode. He didn't speak, but I understood the message. Nicole had come prepared for a battle. "Let's begin," Harold said, opening a thick folder. His voice was highly professional, but I could hear the tension underneath. The last will and testament of Andre Lawson, executed on the 15th day of February, 2024. 3 months before my son died. Harold read each clause slowly, clearly, and with every sentence he read, I watched Nicole's face shift through a chain of emotions she could barely conceal. Smug satisfaction, confusion, then rage, covered by a thin, fragile mask. Nicole was to receive the lakeside house at Lake Louisville, the investment portfolio with Meridian Partners, and a life insurance policy valued at $500,000. It sounded like a lot. Until Harold continued. The family home at 2847 Willow Bend Drive, both vehicles, the Mercedes and the Range Rover, and the personal bank account at First National Bank, are bequeathed to his mother, Patricia Lawson. The room fell silent. I sat there with my hands tightly clasped, feeling as if my ears had heard wrong. The house, the cars, the bank account? Andre had left them to me? Left them. "That's impossible," Nicole blurted out, her perfect manicure gripping the leather armrest. "We bought that house together. It's marital property." Harold slid a document across the table, his voice still calm. "The house was purchased entirely in Andre's name before he married you. It was never converted into shared marital property. The title documents and mortgage records confirm this." Nicole's hands tightened. She tried to stay composed, but I could see the fracture in her control. "And what about Miles's college fund?" Nicole demanded, her voice sharper. "Andre always said he was saving money for Miles's education." Harold nodded. "Mr. Lawson established a trust for Miles's educational expenses, and you are not the trustee of that trust." "Then who is?" Nicole's question was almost a hiss. Harold glanced at me very briefly, then said clearly, "Patricia has been appointed as trustee for all funds related to Miles's care and education." Silence again. I could almost see the calculations running behind Nicole's eyes, totaling assets, mapping routes, building a response. "This is ridiculous," she finally said, her voice carefully tuned to sound like wounded confusion rather than anger. But I could see fury boiling under the surface. "Andre and I discussed our estate plan. This doesn't resemble anything we agreed on." Harold cleared his throat softly. "The will was updated 3 months ago. Andre came to see me specifically to make these changes. Everything was executed and witnessed legally." 3 months ago. Nicole narrowed her eyes. "He never told me about any changes." "That was his right," Harold replied curtly. I sat still, trying to grasp the full meaning of what I had just heard. 3 months ago, Andre had secretly revised his will to ensure I had a home and financial security. while limiting Nicole's access to certain things, and that timing matched the period when Andre had seemed especially anxious. My son had been bringing Miles to stay with me more often for those father-son weekends I had once suspected were really Andre's way of creating space to deal with problems in his marriage. "There must be some mistake," Nicole said, then turned to me with a practiced, pleading expression. "Patricia, you know Andre wanted his family to stay in their home. You have your own house. Surely you're not going to take our home away from Miles, are you?" A very subtle manipulation, turning the enforcement of Andre's wishes into a story where I was taking something from my grandson instead of from her. "I'm just as surprised as you are, Nicole," I said honestly. "I need time to process all of this." Harold continued reading other details, bequests to charities, funeral expenses that had been arranged in advance. Throughout it all, I noticed Nicole was texting under the table. Her face wore a just enough mask of grief, occasionally cracking with flashes of calculation. When the meeting ended, Nicole's attorney, Gerald Winters, finally spoke for the first time. "We need to consider our options. This will may be contested on certain grounds." Harold didn't flinch. "That is her right, but I assure you everything was done properly." Nicole stood, shot me a cold look, and tossed out a "we'll talk soon" as if it were a promise, not a threat. After she left the room, Harold asked me to stay a moment longer. Once the door closed, Harold sat across from me, his voice softening. "There's more," he said. "Andre left this for you with instructions. Deliver privately, after the initial reading." Harold handed me a sealed envelope. My name was written on it in familiar handwriting. My hands began to shake. Andre's handwriting. Firm strokes, slightly slanted to the right. How many times had I seen that handwriting? On report cards, on birthday cards, on sticky notes left on the refrigerator, and now, on a letter my son wrote knowing that one day he might not be here. Should I held the envelope, unsure whether I had the strength to open it now. "Take it home," Harold advised. "Read it when you're alone and ready. And Patricia..." He paused, the professionalism melting away. Andre knew exactly what he was doing. Trust that. I nodded, slipped the envelope into my purse, and stood to leave. In the lobby, I saw Nicole on the phone, her back turned to the reception desk. I stopped, out of her line of sight, but close enough to hear. "This completely blindsided me," Nicole said, her voice low but filled with anger. "The house, the cars, even access to Miles's education trust. No, I don't think he suspected anything. It must be his mother's influence." She paused, as if listening to the person on the other end. "Of course I'll fight, Sean. I gave 10 years to this family. I deserve more than a vacation property and insurance money." Sean Whitaker, the man I had seen at the reception after the funeral. I quietly retreated, taking the stairwell instead of waiting for the elevator, where Nicole might see me if she turned around. My mind ran like a machine, questions stacking on top of questions. But one thing was becoming clearer and clearer, so clear it made my blood run cold. Andre had predicted something that I was only just beginning to understand. Back at my house in the colony, with Miles still at school, I finally had enough space to do the one thing I had been avoiding since I walked out of Harold's office: open the envelope. I sat down at the kitchen table, the oak table my husband bought for me 30 years ago. How many family meals had taken place here? How many of Andre's homework assignments had I sat beside him through right here under the old yellow kitchen light? My hands were still shaking as I tore the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of letter paper printed on Andre's law office letterhead. I took a deep breath and began to read. "Mom, if you're reading this, the unthinkable has happened. I'm sorry for leaving this burden on you, but there is no one I trust more. My marriage has been failing for some time. What began as distance has grown into something more troubling. I've discovered things about Nicole that make me fear for Miles's emotional future and for your safety." I stopped, lifting a hand to wipe away the tears spilling over. Andre knew. My son knew his marriage was collapsing. Not the kind of collapse that comes from ordinary arguments, but the kind that made a careful man like Andre use the word safety when speaking about his own mother. I lowered my head and kept reading, my vision blurring. I have arranged everything to protect you and Miles. The house, the cars, and the money are not truly for you. They are tools to ensure Miles has a stable, loving caregiver when I'm no longer here. Even while facing his own death, Andre was still thinking with the voice of a father arranging living conditions for his son. Nicole will fight this. She will try to manipulate you. Don't let her know what you know or suspect. Observe and wait. Document everything related to Miles's care. I clenched the paper. My chest ached as if it were being crushed, not because I was shocked, but because Andre was speaking in my voice. Observe. Wait. Document. My son was leaning on the very things I had taught him. Harold has the rest of the instructions and the evidence I collected. He will help when the time is right. By the time I reached that line, my throat tightened, but I forced myself to keep reading because it felt like if I stopped, Andre would disappear a second time. I love you, Mom. You taught me to see people clearly and plan ahead. I'm relying on those qualities now to protect my son. Andre, I pressed the letter against my chest as if I could hold Andre inside me a little longer. Fresh tears spilled, hot and salty. Even after he was gone, my son had still given me a mission. And this time, I understood exactly what that mission was. For Miles's future, for my son's sake, I would have to become something I had never been before. A strategic opponent, in a war I already knew would be a war of will and manipulation, with Nicole. I picked up my phone and called Harold. I've read the letter, I said bluntly, without preamble. Andre mentioned evidence. I need to see all of it. I'll arrange for a package to be delivered to your home tomorrow morning, Harold replied. Then his voice lowered slightly. Patricia, there's one more thing. I advise you to install a surveillance system at your house. Cameras in the common areas, a security system that sends alerts to your phone. Why? I asked, even though I was already beginning to understand. If Miles is going to spend more time there, we need to record everything, Harold said, choosing his words carefully. Audio capability may prove valuable. The true meaning hit me with icy clarity. This wasn't about security. It was about evidence. And if you're listening to this, I want you to pause for one beat and put yourself in my place at that moment. You've just lost your son. You're holding a letter like you're holding ashes. But then you realize your son didn't just die. He managed to leave a map. A map leading straight to the most terrifying question of all. What did Nicole do that made Andre prepare like this? Because no one writes lines like document everything if they're only sad about a marriage growing cold. People write that only when they're afraid something could happen to a child. And from that moment on, I knew I no longer had the right to be weak. I had to be alert. For Miles. That afternoon, when I picked Miles up from Jasper High, his eyes lit up the instant he saw me. It was a brief spark of joy. And then the sadness rolled back in like a wave. Grandma! Miles ran to me, his backpack thumping against his back. Ms. Martinez said I can turn in my science project late, but I still want to do it. Dad always helped me with projects. I swallowed hard against my tears. I knelt to his level and placed my hands on his small shoulders. Then I'll help you, I said softly. We'll do it together, okay? So Dad can be proud. Miles nodded vigorously, then wrapped his arms around me. I felt his small body trembling, like he was trying to hold back something far too large for an 8-year-old. I miss Dad, Grandma, he said, his voice choking. Every day I miss him. I do too, sweetheart, I whispered. I do too. On the drive back to Willow Bend, the house that was now legally mine, though I still couldn't believe it, Miles stayed quiet, staring out the window as if the world outside was passing by without being able to touch him. Where's Mom? He finally asked. I chose my words with extreme care. Your mom is handling some work matters, I said. You'll stay with me a few more nights. Is that okay? Miles nodded, but didn't say anything else. In the rearview mirror, I watched him fidget with the bracelet Andre had given him for his 8th birthday, only 2 months before my son died. The next morning, after I dropped Miles off at school, a large manila envelope was delivered to my house by courier. I set it on the kitchen table, that same oak table. Then I opened it. Inside were printed copies of text messages between Nicole and someone saved in her phone under the initials SW, I assumed Sean Whitaker, dated sporadically over the past 8 months. Andre had clearly gained access to Nicole's phone records in ways that I chose not to question, especially given my son's legal background. I read them line by line. The messages painted a cursed picture, an affair that had started nearly a year ago. Plans discussed, then revised. Complaints about Andre working late, about Nicole feeling trapped in the marriage. And worse than all of it, the way she referred to Miles as a complication in her plans with the other man. But what froze my blood the most were exchanges from just 2 months earlier. SW. How long are we going to keep this hanging in the air? You said you were ready to leave. Nicole. Be patient. Jay's name is on everything important. We need the finances in a better position first. SW. The Cayman real estate won't wait forever. The perfect chance for a new start. Nicole. Trust me, just a few more months, Max. Everything will be settled. I collapsed into the chair, my hands ice cold. These weren't just affair messages. They were a plan. Nicole wanted to leave Andre, but before she left, she wanted the finances in a better position. And Jay, the name she used in the messages, had to be Andre. The way she called him held no respect at all. It sounded like she was talking about an obstacle, not a husband. A question rose up, sharp as a blade. Had Andre seen these messages and changed the will in response? Was that why Nicole looked so shocked when she heard the terms? In the package, there was another document, a report from a private investigator Andre had hired. Inside were photos of Nicole and Sean Whitaker entering a hotel together, expense summaries showing gifts Sean had bought for her, and background information on Whitaker's business dealings, details that made me feel they were ethically questionable. The last item was a handwritten note from Andre to Harold, dated only 3 weeks before my son died. Harold attached is everything I've collected. I'm not sure what my next step should be. Confronting her could endanger my access to Miles if things turn ugly. Miles has to be protected above all else. Meet me next Thursday to discuss options. Andre. I stared at the words next Thursday until my eyes hurt. Andre died on Tuesday. That meeting never happened. Armed with this knowledge, everything inside me became terrifyingly clear. Andre protected Miles in the only way my son still could with the time he had left. He handed Miles to me, placed legal power in my hands, and left me a map leading to the truth. Now I had to finish what my son had started. It was time to put my psychology degree to the most important work of my life, not to teach, not to research, but to protect a child from his own mother. During the first week after reading Andre's letter, I began taking notes like it was a survival habit. Harold sent me a thick, durable leather journal. When he handed it to me, he said only briefly, "For legal purposes." Then he instructed me carefully, as if he were giving me a guide for staying alive. Every observation, every interaction with Nicole, every reaction from Miles. Write down the dates, the times, specific details. So I did. I also had the camera system installed exactly as Harold advised. The technician came to the Willow Bend house, the house that was now mine, though honestly, I still wasn't used to thinking of it that way, and installed discrete cameras in the living room, the kitchen, the hallway. Not in bedrooms or bathrooms, but enough to record everything in the shared areas. "The system will send alerts to your phone," the technician said. "Everything is saved to the cloud. You can check it any time." Nicole didn't know about those cameras. And that was exactly what Harold wanted. In the days that followed, Nicole showed up at scattered times, often without warning. The reasons were always appropriate. To pick up a few things, or to check on Miles. But in reality, every time she came, she spent more time rummaging through Andre's office, combing through documents, checking banking records, than calling her attorney in whispers stretched tight as a wire. I documented everything, line by line. March 8th, Nicole arrived at 3:00 p.m., stayed 45 minutes. Spent 10 minutes with Miles, asked about school but eyes glued to phone, 35 minutes in Andre's office, left without saying goodbye to Miles. March 10th, Nicole called at 8:00 p.m., promised to take Miles to the movies this weekend. Miles excited. Note: monitor whether she follows through. March 12th, Nicole canceled, texted, emergency came up. Miles cried at bedtime. A week after the funeral, I was sitting at the kitchen table helping Miles with math when he suddenly looked up, so worried my heart tightened. "Grandma, Mom says I have to go with her to Miami this weekend, but I don't want to go." That was the first time I heard about Miami. Miami? I tried to keep my voice normal while alarms were already blaring in my head. That sounds like an adventure. Miles shook his head, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. "Mom said her friend Sean has a boat and will stay at a fancy hotel, but I have a science project due Monday, and Dad always helped me with projects." His voice caught on the word Dad. I gently smoothed his hair. "Did you tell your mom about the project?" "Yes." Miles nodded, his eyes reddening. "Mom said I can skip it. The teacher will understand because my dad died. But Dad wouldn't want me to skip it. Dad always said commitments matter." "Your dad is right," I said, speaking while storing every word in my mind. "Let me talk to your mom tomorrow." That night, after Miles fell asleep, I called Harold immediately. "Miami?" Harold's voice sharpened instantly. "With Sean Whitaker?" He said, "Friend Sean has a boat." I confirmed. "Harold, what is she planning to do?" Harold asked right away. "Have you installed the surveillance system?" "Yes, it was completed yesterday." "Good. Video footage may prove valuable." He paused, then his voice grew heavier. "Sean Whitaker is the real estate developer I mentioned, the one Andre had ethical concerns about." I put my hand on the journal. My heart was pounding, but my mind was turning colder. And if you're listening to this, pause for one beat, because this is where I began to understand. Andre's death was not the end of the story. It was only the moment the curtain rose. An 8-year-old child in grief being pulled far away with friend Sean who has a boat. Miami sounded like a vacation, but in my mind, there was only one question. Why Miami, and why now? Because some trips aren't for healing. Therefore, repositioning the adults in a new story. And in that new story, Miles might be nothing more than an inconvenient accessory. The next afternoon, Nicole came to the house to pick up a few things. I guided the conversation carefully. "Miles said you're planning a trip to Miami?" "Just a short weekend trip," Nicole replied, glancing at her expensive watch. "It's good for him to have a distraction." "He's worried about being late with his science project," I said gently. "Andre always took school seriously." Nicole's smile tightened. "One weekend won't ruin his GPA. The school psychologist recommended new experiences to process grief." I nodded, then let a very light sentence slip, soft but sharp enough. "A boat trip with Sean. His name is Sean, right? Isn't that a little much right after he just lost his father?" Nicole's eyes narrowed by the smallest degree. "Miles will be fine. Kids adapt quickly." I agreed, but still offered. I could keep Miles home to finish the project. I saw calculation flicker behind her eyes. Free weekend without a child, or maintaining the image of a devoted mother. "Thoughtful, but not necessary," she concluded. "This trip is about mother-son bonding." Only a day later, Nicole called back, her voice soft in the way people speak when they want something. "Patricia, I've been thinking. Could you keep Miles this weekend? I have a few things I need to handle. It'll be easier without—" She trailed off, but I understood. Easier without her son there. Then 2 days later, Nicole changed her mind again. Friday night, she showed up to pick up Miles, wearing a thin floral dress, completely inappropriate for early March in Texas. "Change of plans," she announced brightly. "We're going to Miami after all. Sean arranged everything." Miles looked at me, terrified, like he was pleading for help. "But Mom, my science project—" "You can do it later," Nicole cut him off. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity," I barely managed to say Nicole before she pulled Miles to the door. "We'll be back Sunday night. Good night, Patricia." I stood in the doorway watching the BMW disappear. Miles looked back through the rear window, his face pale, so anxious my heart felt torn open. I called Harold immediately. "She's taking Miles to Miami with Sean Whitaker, right now." "Handled," Harold said with iron certainty. "I hired the same investigator Andre used. We'll have photos of everything. Patricia, Miami is useful for our purposes. It shows her priorities. But what if Miles gets hurt? Document his emotional state when he returns. Have him speak with a counselor. Every reaction becomes evidence." Miles came back Sunday night, hours later than promised. His shoulders were sunburned, his stomach hurt from too much ice cream, and he had a kind of emotional withdrawal that broke me. Nicole came in behind him, her fingers still tapping out messages non-stop as if nothing had happened. "How was the trip, sweetheart?" I asked, kneeling to his eye level. Miles shrugged, eyes down. "The boat made me seasick." "You're being dramatic," Nicole cut in without looking up. 5-star resort, perfect weather." "He had a great time." But Miles's face told the opposite story. He flicked a quick glance toward his mother, then muttered, "Can I go to my room?" "Of course," I said softly. "I'll bring you ginger tea." Then I realized he wasn't carrying his backpack. Where did Miles forget his school bag? Nicole waved a hand. "It got wet on the boat." "Nothing important. The science project materials were in there. He'll ask for an extension. I'll write a note." This time she looked up, her eyes like she was daring me to react. I only nodded, and in my mind I added another line to my journal. Upstairs, Miles sat on the bed staring at Andre's photo. His homework was still untouched on the desk, clearly not opened all weekend. "Do you want to tell Grandma about the trip?" I asked, sitting beside him. Miles's lower lip trembled. Mom was on her phone the whole time. Mom and Sean talked about grown-up stuff. Then they left me with the hotel babysitter. "All night?" Miles nodded, eyes wet. 2 nights. The babysitter fell asleep watching TV, and I got scared because I didn't know where I was when I woke up. I called Mom's room, but she didn't answer. I kept my face neutral, but inside I boiled. An 8-year-old child, an unfamiliar hotel, calling his mother with no answer. Every detail was evidence, and also a cut straight into my heart. "You must have been really scared," I said, pulling Miles into my arms. Miles pressed his face into my shoulder. "Sean has a big boat, but he wouldn't let me touch anything. He said, 'Kids ruin everything.'" And Mom laughed, even though Dad always let me help steer the little boat at our house. "Did you tell your mom you were scared or sad?" Miles shook his head. Mom was happy. In the car, she said her being happy again matters, and I shouldn't make it hard by complaining. I held Miles closer, swallowing my anger so I could keep him safe inside my arms. "You're allowed to have feelings," I told him. "Even when adults are happy, your feelings matter too." Miles leaned into me, softening a little. "Dad always asked about my feelings," he whispered. "I know, sweetheart. I know." That night, after ginger tea and my attempt to salvage the science project, I went downstairs and opened Harold's leather journal. I wrote everything down. The times, the words, the reactions, the sentences that made Miles blame himself, and the silences of a child placed in the wrong role inside a life too big. And when I set my pen down, I understood with absolute clarity. The Miami trip wasn't just a weekend, it was a sign that Nicole was ready to place her new life above her own son. In the 2 weeks after the Miami trip, I began to see a frightening pattern emerge, clear as if someone were drawing it, stroke by stroke, right in front of my eyes. Nicole came home later and later without explanation. Miles stayed with me more and more often. She missed the parent-teacher conference, then sent me in her place with a vague reason that sounded very by the book. Inheritance meetings. She forgot to refill Miles's asthma medication, forcing me to rush to the pharmacy in an emergency when he had a mild flare-up during soccer practice. All of it. I didn't just remember, I documented it. One by one, timestamp by timestamp, detail by detail, things that seemed small, but when placed side by side formed a troubling picture, a mother increasingly detached from the daily life of her son. March 22nd, 6:30 p.m. Nicole called, said she would come at 7 o'clock to have dinner with Miles. I cooked his favorite meal, fried chicken and mashed potatoes. Miles sat by the window, waiting from 6:45. 7:15. Nicole called back. Something came up. Can you feed Miles dinner? Miles tried to hide his disappointment, but I saw it clearly. His small shoulders drooped like a leaf that had just lost all its strength. March 25th, 3 o'clock p.m. The school called. Miles had an asthma episode during PE. He needed his inhaler. I checked. It had been empty for 2 weeks. Nicole had been reminded 3 times to refill it, but still didn't. In the end, I got the medication myself, then added the detail to the medical record file Harold was helping me build. March 28th, parent-teacher conference. Nicole did not come. I met Ms. Martinez, Miles's teacher. She said, Miles is a special child. But her eyes were full of worry. He's struggling. Homework isn't being completed. He's distracted in class. Has he talked to anyone about his feelings? I explained about the grief counselor Harold had arranged, a kind woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in childhood grief. Good, Ms. Martinez nodded, because Miles needs support. And he needs consistency. Consistency. Exactly what Nicole was not providing. The camera system Harold told me to install began capturing moments Nicole didn't even know were being recorded, and those moments were the ones that made my blood run cold. Footage, March 26th, 8:45 p.m. Nicole brought Sean Whitaker to the house. They were both slightly drunk. Miles was upstairs, supposedly asleep, but on the hallway camera I saw his small shadow at the top of the stairs, silent, motionless, as if he were trying to understand what was happening. The kitchen camera captured Nicole and Sean kissing, laughing, then opening a bottle of wine from Andre's wine cabinet. I saved the clip, sent it to Harold with a short note. Miles witnessed this. Footage, March 30th, 4:15 p.m. Nicole instructed Miles, remember to tell Grandma you had a great time today, okay? But the camera showed she was there for exactly 30 minutes, spending most of that time on the phone, while Miles sat alone doing homework. Footage, April 2nd, 6 o'clock p.m. Nicole promised she would come watch Miles's soccer game, then canceled at the last minute. The camera caught Miles's face when he heard. He tried to be brave, but his eyes lit with tears. 3 weeks after the funeral, Nicole came to me with a clear agenda. She arrived in the evening, right as I was helping Miles with homework. She wore a sleek black suit, looking like someone walking into a meeting instead of a widow in mourning. Patricia, we need to discuss the situation with the house, she said, then sat down on the living room sofa as if it were the waiting room of an office. Of course, I replied, gentle and agreeable, keeping the supportive demeanor I had chosen as my strategy. Would you like some coffee? Yes, Nicole said, her eyes tracking me as I moved through the space that was now, legally, my home. When I brought her the cup, Nicole began her speech, and I recognized it immediately. It had been rehearsed. This is too much, she said, her voice trembling in all the right places. Paperwork, accounts, decisions. Andre handled everything. Now it's all on me and... She paused, as if overwhelmed by emotion. I didn't rush her. I let her finish the performance. This house holds too many memories of Andre, Nicole continued, her tone adjusted into something fragile. Every room reminds Miles of what he's lost. Maybe it would be better for him, for both of us, if we could start over somewhere else. You're thinking of moving? I asked, as if I were still surprised. I found a beautiful condo in downtown Dallas, near the Arts District. Excellent schools, walking distance to the art museum and the library. She stirred her coffee slowly, deliberately. The problem is, Patricia, with the way Andre arranged everything, I'm going to need your cooperation. Oh? I tilted my head as if I hadn't expected it. The will situation clearly looks like some kind of mistake or misunderstanding, she said, her voice hardening for a beat, then snapping right back into reasonable grief. Andre would never intentionally put me in a difficult position like this. Then she continued, perfectly timed, an attack delivered in a calm voice. I spoke with my attorney. He believes we can avoid prolonged legal proceedings if you simply transfer the house into my name, as Andre intended. And here, if you're still following this story with me, listen very carefully. There are people who never come to talk things out. They come to set a trap. They dress it in the language of for the child, for the family, for healing. But underneath, there is only one goal: to take back what they want, as quickly as possible. And the moment Nicole said those words, I understood. This was no longer about grief. This was a negotiation, and Miles was being used as leverage. I widened my eyes just enough to show consideration, not the fury burning in my chest. I understand, I said slowly. And what does your attorney say about the fact that Andre updated the will only 3 months ago to make these arrangements specifically? A flicker of irritation crossed Nicole's face, so fast most people would miss it. But I didn't. Andre wasn't himself in the last few months, she said. He worked too hard, was stressed about cases. He wasn't thinking clearly about what was in the best interest of our family. That must have been very hard for both of you. I nodded, as if I were leaning toward her. Yes, she sighed dramatically. That's why I believe Andre wanted us to correct this oversight, right now, for Miles's sake. The Miles card was played exactly as I had predicted. I stayed quiet for a beat, then said, I understand your concern, but making rushed decisions while we're grieving isn't wise. Maybe we should give ourselves time to adjust before making major changes. Nicole's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. Of course you need time, she said, but her voice carried a trace of impatience. But the condo I found won't stay available for long. It'll be easier for Miles if we solve this quickly, so he can begin healing in a new environment. I recognized the sales tactic instantly, false urgency to force a decision. Why don't we ask Miles how he feels about moving? I suggested gently. He might find comfort staying in the home with so many memories of his dad. Children don't always know what's best for them, Nicole replied smoothly. That's why adults make decisions. Besides, he's had enough instability already. I don't want to add pressure by making him feel like he has to choose. She positioned herself as the protector, while subtly implying that if I asked Miles, I would be harming him. I nodded slightly, as if conceding. Maybe you're right, and I saw a small flash of relief pass across her face. Let me think about it for a few days. Nicole left, not forgetting to remind me, time is important. The moment the door closed, I called Harold. She just made an official proposal, I said. She wants me to transfer the house, framing it like it's what Andre wanted. Perfect, Harold replied, his voice carrying a cold note of satisfaction. Another clear piece of evidence of motive. Patricia, I just received the investigation report on the Miami trip. He paused, then said something that made my grip tighten around the phone. The photos show Nicole and Sean Whitaker in the same room at the Four Seasons. Miles was placed in a separate room with a babysitter from the hotel service. The babysitter confirmed she was hired for both nights, from 7 p.m. to 8 a.m. So Nicole left her son alone overnight, just weeks after he lost his father, to be with her lover? My voice shook with anger and pain. Yes, and we have documentation. I swallowed hard. Harold, I said, my voice hardening with a kind of resolve I didn't think I still had. Andre wrote that you have the rest of the evidence. I think it's time I see everything. Meet me tomorrow morning, Harold said. And Patricia, brace yourself. What Andre discovered, it explains why he was so worried that he did all of this. That night, after Miles was asleep, he was growing used to staying with me more nights than with his mother. I sat in the living room with a cup of tea. This Willow Bend house was overflowing with memories. Everywhere I looked, I saw Andre, sitting on that sofa reading case files, standing in the kitchen flipping pancakes for Miles on Saturday mornings, joking in the backyard, teaching his son how to kick a soccer ball. Nicole was right about one thing. The house was full of memories of Andre. But those memories weren't something to run from. They were precious. They were all Miles had left of his father. I remembered Andre's letter. The house, the cars, and the money are not truly for you. They are tools to ensure Miles has a stable, loving caregiver. My son had known. Somehow, Andre had known Nicole would choose her new life over her own son. Andre had known Miles would need me, and I would not fail him. I opened the journal and added today's entry. April 5. Nicole made an official request to transfer the house, framing it as correcting Andre's oversight. Mentioned plans to move to Dallas with Miles. When asked about Miles's feelings, stated that children don't know what's best. Did not mention consulting teachers, counselors, or anyone concerned with Miles's actual welfare. I closed the journal, feeling the weight of responsibility press against my chest, but also feeling something clearer than I had ever felt before. Tomorrow, Harold would show me all the evidence. Tomorrow, I would fully understand what Andre had discovered, and after that, we would decide the next step. The next morning, in Harold's office, I finally saw the entire picture Andre had quietly assembled during the last months of his life. On the table lay a thick case file, organized by sections the way an attorney prepares for battle, not the way a desperate husband tries to hold a family together. Financial records showed that Nicole had quietly transferred money from the joint account into her own private account. There were chains of emails between her and Sean about future plans in the Cayman Islands. And most alarming of all, there were messages discussing how to deal with the Miles issue after everything is finalized. Harold kept his voice low, but every sentence he spoke landed like stone. Andre discovered these things about 4 months before he passed, Harold said. He was preparing to confront Nicole, but he wanted a solid plan first. I lowered my gaze to the pages, as if I were looking at a second life my son had been living, a life I never knew existed, where Andre had been a husband, a father, and quietly on defense at the same time. Tears spilled before I could stop them. My son died carrying this burden, I said, my voice catching. Harold shook his head slightly, as if correcting the truth back into its rightful place. He died knowing he had protected Miles, Harold corrected. Then he looked straight at me. Patricia, it's time we execute Andre's emergency plan. We're going to file for temporary custody. I drew a deep breath. Inside me, the grief was still there. But right beside it, something else began to rise. Clarity. 2 weeks later, I sat in Collin County Court, my hands ice cold, trembling slightly even though I tried to stay calm. On the bench was Judge Carlton, a strict woman in her 60s, with eyes sharp enough to see through every mask. Nicole sat across from me with her expensive attorney, Gerald Winters. Nicole's face was flawless as always, a mask of the wounded widow, attacked at the moment she was most vulnerable. Harold presented our evidence slowly, methodically, as if laying brick by brick, my written journal. The camera footage, Miles's psychological evaluation, proof of the Miami trip, and documentation showing Nicole had proposed using Miles as leverage, Gerald Winters countered immediately. He tried to paint me as an interfering mother-in-law, exploiting a time when Nicole was grieving to seize control, but then Judge Carlton looked directly at me and questioned me herself. In that moment, I knew, if I spoke from anger, I would lose. If I spoke from revenge, I would lose too. So I spoke from the only thing I could never fake, the heart of a grandmother. Your Honor, I said, slow and clear, I'm not trying to replace Nicole as Miles's mother. I'm only requesting temporary measures to ensure his needs are prioritized during this particularly vulnerable time. The evidence shows that right now, other priorities are being placed ahead of those needs. The room fell silent. An hour later, Judge Carlton delivered her ruling. Her voice wasn't loud, but it dropped with the clarity of a gavel strike. The court finds sufficient grounds for emergency intervention. Temporary guardianship of Miles Lawson is granted to Patricia Lawson for 60 days. I closed my eyes for 1 second, not because I felt victorious, but because, for the first time since Andre died, I felt Miles had a lifeline. But 3 weeks later, Nicole asked to meet me at Arbor Hills Park. She didn't bring an attorney. No black suit, no sunglasses. She looked strangely exhausted, an exhaustion not of grief, but of calculations dragged on too long. I'm withdrawing from the case, she said simply. I'm signing full custody over to you. I sat frozen, almost unable to believe what I was hearing. Why? I asked. Nicole stared into the distance, as if she were talking about a travel itinerary, not the life of a child. Sean and I are moving to Grand Cayman next month. He has the rights to develop a major resort. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I swallowed hard. And Miles? Nicole shrugged. Miles needs stability. I can't provide that right now. I'll send support money. Video call when I can. The cold indifference robbed me of words for a moment, but beneath the sorrow was a relief so deep it reached my bones. Miles wouldn't have to drag this legal fight out. Miles wouldn't have to live through a cycle of promises and disappearances. Miles would finally be at peace. Grandma, I got the lead role in the school play. That voice yanked me out of memory like sudden sunlight. Miles, now 11 years old, burst into the house, his eyes shining. In that single instant, I knew the last 3 years had not been wasted. 3 years had transformed my grandson in ways I never dared to hope for at the beginning. Steady grades, close friends, and a smile, a real smile, returning little by little, the way a wound heals on its own schedule. I took the script from his hands. Our Town by Thornton Wilder, I read, then looked up. The role of George Gibbs. I'm so proud of you. Miles grinned, then suddenly hesitated as if he'd remembered something. Ms. Larson said my dad also played this role when he was in 8th grade. Did you know that? Warmth spread through my chest. We had kept Andre alive through stories, photos, and small traditions. Not to deepen the pain, but so Miles would know his father's love had never disappeared. I remember it clearly, I said, gently touching his cheek. Your dad would be so proud to know you're following in his footsteps. Miles pressed his lips together in a small smile, then spoke more quietly. Should I tell Mom? Nicole had vanished from Miles's daily life after she moved away. The video calls she promised at first became less frequent, and then stopped entirely. I didn't want to decide for him. This was something Miles needed to choose, not based on what adults wanted, but based on what his heart could handle. It's your decision, sweetheart, I said. Miles shook his head, firm. No. It's not necessary. You and Uncle Harold and the Wilsons are enough. I pulled him into my arms, and I realized sometimes healing isn't your mother coming back. Healing is not having to wait anymore. That night, after Miles was asleep, I opened a box of personal belongings and found Andre's final letter. The paper had yellowed slightly, as if time itself had touched it. Mom, if you're reading this, you did it. You protected Miles the way I no longer could. Tell him about me. Not only the good things, but the true things, too, about my mistakes and how I tried to correct them. Love always has the last word. Andre. I pressed the letter to my chest, and tears fell freely. From a tragedy, we created something beautiful, a new kind of family, not what people expect, but solid and real. True love had the last word, and Andre's legacy, not money or property, but love and protection, still lives every day, in miles. If you've made it this far, maybe you understand too. Sometimes love isn't loud, but it's steady enough to change the entire future of a child. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories of awakening, protection, and fate-shifting reversals, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And if you've ever had a Patricia in your life, someone who quietly stood in the wind for you, leave a comment. Just one sentence is enough.